Hello and welcome to Season 2 of the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, here today with episode 58. In the last episode, I spoke about one man, Saluva Narasimha, the man who saved the Vijayanagara kingdom from disintegration. He did this not only through military prowess and strong administrative tactics, but above all, he did it with conviction. And when the last of the Sangamas, Praudaraya, having made a mockery of his position as ruler, fled the kingdom, Narasimha, with the encouragement of a fed-up citizenry, both patricians and plebeians, was crowned king in 1486. The story from here on takes a distinct turn with the emergence of Krishnadevaraya and very soon afterwards the rise of the Mysore Empire and the creation of Bangalore. I ended the last episode by quoting from Pernao Nunez's account of the storming of the palace by Narasimha's trusted commander, Narasanayaka, and this laid the groundwork for the telling of the history that followed. And this episode, it's an interlude episode in the historical narrative that allows me to talk about how the history of the Deccan was written. And all that in a minute, right after I take this pause to thank the Prestige Group for supporting this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When we speak about the history of the Deccan, the question it raises from the backbenches of thought is how any of all our history was told, by whom, and what was the purpose of recording events. I have pursued the research of the history of Bangalore and the larger Karnataka region for this podcast, and it has been fascinating simply from what one can observe of the way that the events of the past were laid out. I bring up the subject now because we are at the point in history where there is a noticeable change in the quality of the available information. It's more linear, it's more organized, and that's what's available to historians compared to how it was when we looked at the span of records of the early medieval Deccan. And this merits a brief look at exactly what all this means. So please join me in this somewhat detailed journey. In the early medieval Deccan, the task of recording history served a different purpose than as we know it today. It was not an effort to create an objective chronicle, nor was it a pursuit of factual precision. Rather, it was a deeply political and spiritual act. It was an affirmation of legitimacy, power, and divine favor of the kings. Copperplate inscriptions, stone edict, and temple grants were primary means of documenting the past. They detailed royal genealogies, donations to Brahmin institutions, the founding of temples, and military victories, always presented in a style that reinforced the cosmic order, placing the king as the earthly instrument of that higher divine will. Dynasties such as the Batapi Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, the Kalyani Chalukyas, all of them left behind thousands of such records. Yet these inscriptions told us little about the messy realities of political conflict, administrative structures, and mainly of the lives of ordinary people. History in this period was less about recording change and more about proclaiming continuity. Continuity of dharma, of royal virtue, of social order. So by the time of the later medieval Deccan, especially under the Yadavas of Devagiri, for example, this tradition had grown even more elaborate. Now, I mentioned Devagiri specifically, or Daulatabad as it came to be known, because court scholars like the super famous Hemadri had compiled massive religious compendia, such as the Vratakhanda, celebrating not only the king's patronage of temples, but also codifying rituals and practices that reinforced the socio-religious fabric of the day. These works stood as monuments of cultural identity. It tied political authority to religious orthodoxy, and that whole business of the divine right of kings was always sought to be set in place in the order. So any telling of the history, any telling of the events, even if it was a simple land grant, had to be done in this manner and keeping this agenda in view. In the meanwhile, with the emergence of the Bahmani Sultanate in the 14th century, a different mode of historical writing entered the Deccan. Persian language chronicles, such as Ishami's Futwa Salatin and later works like Ferishta's histories, introduced new literary forms, drawing more on the Middle East traditions of courtly historiography. Here too, the recording of history remained largely celebratory. Sultans were praised as the champions of faith, their conquests framed as divine victories. It was more of the same, even though there was qualitatively a little bit of difference. Along with these texts at that point in time, there was monumental architecture like grand mosques and tombs and palaces and forts, all of them inscribing their power physically into the landscape, offering a visual narrative that paralleled the written word. But throughout the centuries, one pattern remains clear. History was crafted to serve authority. It was not intended to be a neutral recounting of events at all. Rather, it sought to instruct, inspire, legitimize, presenting a vision of the past that sanctified the present of the day. Now, modern historiography, at least by the intentions of the Academy, represent a profound shift from these early Indian traditions. Today, historians approach these medieval records not as neutral accounts but as artifacts to be interrogated and questioned and taken apart and examined, and from all that data, history to be culled. So they do it by asking critical questions such as, who produced these records? For what audience? What political, religious, or social purpose were they trying to serve? They read not only as what is said, but also what is not said, what is omitted. The silences around dissent, defeat, or disruption spoke more loudly than what was written on the Prashasti. Drawing on archaeology, epigraphy, numismatics, linguistics, environmental studies, and all the other disciplines that together make up history, modern historians were able to construct a more complex, a more layered understanding of the Deccan's past. They examined the movements of people, the interactions between different cultures and religions, also the working of economics, like taxation, or how the money movement happened, and of course the realities of social life outside and beyond the royal courts. In this modern method, the study of history itself becomes a part of history. It reveals not just what happened, but how each age and era sought to remember and justify and shape its own history. It is through this lens of critical reading, of questioning, rather than just merely accepting, that we can now look at sources that tell us about these great changes in Karnataka history during the late 15th and the early 16th centuries in particular, especially the rise of new power centers and the men who carved history out of empires in decline. The one thing that we know is that for centuries, history wasn't just about faithfully recording everything that had happened. It was more about who controlled the narrative, and those in power were quick to take and shape it. In modern days, especially under dictatorial regimes, history is often taken away from scholars who are trained to do what they do, just because they didn't align with the ruler's political credo. And of course, there are those who argue that nothing has changed. As much as the early medieval Indian scholars and scribes may have been limited by having to record versions of historical events as dictated by their masters, foreign scholars who visited India presented a view that was independent of the diktats of Indian kings. Let's now look at how things started to change in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, particularly in the telling of history. As much as the Indian scholars and scribes may have been limited by having to record versions of historical events as dictated by their masters, foreign scholars who visited India presented a view that was independent of the diktats of Indian kings. But it wasn't until much later, that the possibility that scientific or academic study could be pursued in an unbiased manner came to settle in universities and laboratories. But for all the talk about democratization of academics and the independence of academies, it wasn't all equal everywhere. The academies of the Western nations enjoyed independence for much earlier and for much longer than the countries that they had colonized. Any notion of academic independence, in a global sense, was not truly global until after World War II, when the world got together and established institutions to protect itself from the possibility of another Armageddon, or otherwise called World War III. For example, in the Deccan, after the early medieval period, the regular history of India started to be told by Middle Eastern scholars, of which there were many. And although these scholars wrote seemingly neutral histories where the victories of native kingdoms were routinely recognized, there was a definitive religious bias, and this bias suggested the superiority of Islam in their case. But to be fair, their histories, that of the Middle East writers, were not the sort of fantastic exaggerations that became common to Prashastis and early Indian literary accounts. But it was not as though that bias, religious or otherwise, that we so easily ascribe to early Indian and Middle Eastern writing was totally absent from British historical writing either. In later years, the writings of colonial British chroniclers routinely suffered from a similar bias, but it was seemingly directed at creating divisions in India. Phrases like Hindu kingdom and Mohammedan invaders peppered their accounts. Communal binaries went towards making a case to prove one's suspicion about the British for using a divide and rule policy in the subcontinent, although there has not been much evidence, written record, of such a policy. And this even though they knew well that the so-called Hindu and Mohammedan kingdoms routinely employed soldiers of the enemy faith. They wouldn't have done that if there really was such an active and potentially dangerous communal binary in effect, who would employ huge divisions of the army to fight people of a similar faith. History needs to be relooked from outside a purely political perspective. Of course, it must be remembered that the bias of the Christian world against the Islamic rulers had been fostered for centuries, maybe on account of the almost ceaseless wars between them that had started from the time of the Umayyad Caliphate in the 8th century in Europe, particularly Spain. Their bias is palpable, say in the writings of Bangalore chroniclers like Benjamin Lewis Rice and Bowring, only to quote two examples, who routinely refer to Indian kings as Hindus and Turkic Arab dynasties as Mohammedan, and colonial attitudes even when praising figures like Hyder Ali. And never by the same measure and equal frequency did the British ever refer to themselves as Christians. And reading these accounts without noticing such references could subliminally influence a bias in the reader, because language and small rhetorical choices do condition our perception. Maybe that was a subliminal, if not explicit, goal. And now for a word from our sponsors. When I come back, more about the historiography of the way the Deccan history was told. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
And now let's move on to the way history was recorded from the 17th century onwards. The India that captivated Europe's imagination from the 17th century was largely that of the later Mughal Empire. It was a realm of dazzling courtly splendor ruthless imperial politics, and from a European perspective, an exotic and bewildering social order dominated by temples, priests, caste hierarchies, and ascetic mysticism. Yet, this fascination was not new. Centuries before, India had already astounded travelers from both the East and the West. Names like Niccolo dai Conti, Domingo Pace, Marco Polo, Fernão Núñez come to mind. These are men who traversed the subcontinent and documented their observations in vivid detail. And from the Middle Eastern world too, scholars and adventurers like Ibn Battuta, Al-Biruni, and Ibn Khordadbeh left us with records of their encounters. To a man, India overwhelmed them. Its wealth, social customs, religious practices, and political systems often seemed unlike anything that they had previously encountered. Military power was not merely demonstrated through vast armies, but also through elaborate ceremonial displays. Religious life was saturated with rituals that defied monotheistic traditions such as Islam and Christianity. Practices such as sati, temple rules, the exclusion of castes, and public displays of devotion bewildered and fascinated these travelers in equal measure. Middle East visitors who hailed from advanced urban centers like Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand wrote of India with awe. Al-Biruni, for instance, despite his renowned scientific and philosophical background, confessed that many Indian customs were way beyond his comprehension. His response, though filled with wonder, demonstrated a real struggle, a profound struggle to reconcile our practices with what he knew of social order. And then, for the Europeans who arrived much later, India's strangeness was all the more pronounced. When European trading communities had established footholds along the Indian coasts, the subcontinent had already been rendered as a land of paradox, immense wealth, boundless learning, yet a place of seemingly incomprehensible superstition and customs. Early European accounts, such as those of Jean-Baptiste Tavernier and Thomas Rowe, did increasingly recognize that India's diversity was not just a matter of religious difference, but extended to its legal systems, political organization, economy, social norms, things that are the hallmark of advanced civilizations. It is this awareness that allowed these travelers to approach India with more curiosity than condemnation. But let it be said that their reports often reflected the biases of their day. Their accounts framed Mughal India as both magnificent and decadent, a civilization under the rule of Mohammedan monarchs presiding over a sea of Hindu subjects. Early Jesuit missionaries who described Akbar's court in the 1580s, for instance, marveled at the emperor's religious tolerance, yet condemned the pluralism that defined his rule. This syncretism of the Mughal court, as in Akbar's creation of the Din-e-Ilahi, for instance, struck Europeans as unsettling. It challenged their rigid theological frameworks. It kind of put them off-center. While the Mughals were a prominent focal point for all of them, the history of India in this period was written principally by foreigners, Middle Eastern, Central Asian, and European historians. And then as Mughal power waned and British influence grew, the task of narrating India's history shifted decisively into colonial hands. Again, terms like Hindu kingdom, Mohammedan Meda became pervasive, categorizing India in a way that suited their colonial politics. This reframing of history was not just incidental. It served the needs of the colonial project. For Britain to justify its rule, it needed to present India as a divided and stagnant land, badly in need of European intervention. So history was not merely a recording of past events, but a tool for governance. However, long before British colonial historians began imposing their ideological constructs, India had already fascinated and puzzled visitors from the East and the West. Those early European travelers like Marco Polo, Conti, Pace, and Núñez spoke of the bustling markets of the Coromandel coast to the opulent courts of the Vijayanagara Empire. Similarly, Arab and Turkic scholars recorded their astonishment at the vast diversity And very often when you read translations of their accounts, the word that comes to mind is awe. For these travelers, India was a land of wonder. Its cities were filled with wealth and commercial activity and left lasting impressions on them. Take Marco Polo, for example. He described places where gold and precious stone seemed almost mundane. Take Fernão Nunes. He marveled at the teeming markets of Vijayanagara, where goods from across Asia and Africa filled the streets. Even Al-Biruni, who was highly trained in sciences and philosophy, was captivated and awed by India's wealth and religious diversity, though he did say that many of its practices appeared contrary to reason by his standards. Despite the sense of awe, these visitors often struggled to understand the customs they encountered. Sati, or naked asceticism, and animal worship bewildered them. It bewildered their sensibilities, even as they refrained from making any outright condemnation or judgment. So Al-Biruni, for instance, made a definite and concerted effort to understand Hindu practices on its own terms. He tried to recognize the challenge of interpreting a culture that was so vastly different from his own. Now, while these Middle Eastern travelers had some prior exposure to India through trade and conquest, for Europeans, the encounter was more recent, more stark, and it came to them like a tsunami. Their reports often conveyed an almost alien sense of unfamiliarity. Indian religion, social hierarchies, and political systems seemed to defy what they knew of their society, which had been defined by, say, a Christian Europe. So by the time the British arrived in the subcontinent, the image of India had already been shaped by these earlier travelers. Those Jesuit missionaries in the 1580s first gave Europe a detailed account of Akbar's court, the land of great wealth, grandeur, and ceremonial magnificence, but tempered with the tyrannical and despotic rule of Mohammedan empires. Yet, despite all of this intellectual shift, their reports still reflected European assumptions about political authority, liberty, and what led later on to this whole narrative of Oriental despotism. As colonial power grew, the British took charge and reframed India's past to fit the needs of their empire. Histories written by British historians in the late 18th century painted India as a land of stagnant traditions awaiting rescue by a rational, dynamic West. These narratives drew on earlier accounts, but layered them with new politically charged interpretations, creating those binaries of which I spoke: civilized versus barbaric, progressive versus backward, and all this serves them rather well. So what began as a record of fascination and wonder evolved into a justification for colonial rule. Now, as we reflect on the way history has been written, shaped, edited, and distorted often by those in power, it becomes clear that the past was never a simple recounting of facts. It was crafted with purpose. It always served as a tool for legitimacy, for control, and of course, for propaganda. And whether we look at ancient inscriptions or colonial narratives or modern scholarly work, we must remain aware of the lens through which history is presented. Well, we do know the old saying, history is written by the victor. Thank you for listening patiently to my presentation on how the historiography of the Deccan till this period seemed to me. In the next episode, I return to the Vijayanagara Empire as we inch even closer to the founding of Bangalore and the growth of the Empire of Mysore. And that is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.